Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of SI Canada. And SI Canada is a national. I'll tell you a little bit about SI Canada and then just introduce our lead speaker today, Erin Miller. SI Canada is a national charitable organization. I think we work with many of you and know many of you. We work to provide a network of people and organizations with tools, resources, and opportunities to tackle real and complex problems and create systemic change. And we think of innovation as the spark that social finance and impact investing is the fuel. It's a key element to actually ensuring that the innovations that are occurring in our social purpose organizations and through our entrepreneurs' ingenuity are actually created and implemented and scaled. And in my over a decade of work in impact investing and social finance, I know that there's no singular pathway to actually achieving investment. And there's this sort of myth of the pitch and the venture society that we have. And it's sort of, I've never seen a one unique way, I've never seen more than one entrepreneur do it in the same way. But I've seen many of them achieve it. And I think that there are actually some real lessons learned. I'm so pleased that Erin is willing to be here and share it with her generosity to share her story today. We're really interested at SI Canada at creating systemic change on those key issues at a national level that cannot be solved in community alone. Things that neither the government, the market, or the civil society can solve on their own, and look for ways that we can help to support shifts at a systemic level. And I think that journalism and independent media is one of those systems. It's described as many as the nervous system of a healthy democracy, crucial to having everyone's voice be heard. And we've seen what happens when it's controlled. It's also an industry that has gone in such incredible transition and turmoil and disruption. We're seeing the legacy media, big legacy media institutions sort of clinging for survival as they fail to adapt to our digital age. And the first cut, when they start to experience that, the first casualty of that disruption was local journalism. It's the first thing they cut off their expense. So this created a real incredible gap in our society, a problematic that people, we were not hearing from all voices. And I just think that Indiegraf is an amazing example of a social entrepreneur with an innovative approach to addressing this kind of systemic challenge. So Erin, we have an incredible panel for you, and I will introduce each of the panelists after Erin's presentation. Erin Miller is the co-founder and CEO of Indiegraf. She's a journalist and an entrepreneur who founded The Discourse, where she led an award-winning journalism team and developed a successful business model for in-depth local news. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'm just going to share my screen here now, so give me a moment. Okay, I'll start just by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the city colonially known as Vancouver, which is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm grateful to live, play, and raise my children here. And in my work, I'm committing to collaborating and partnering with Indigenous people to build more equitable information and storytelling ecosystems that support culture, justice, and self-determination. And now that we've rooted ourselves in that, I'm going to just share my screen here. So over the next 10 minutes, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my personal story and Indiegraf's story and how we're developing a platform to enable independent entrepreneurial journalists to better serve community. But I do want to underline that while Indiegraf is an important part of the ecosystem, the players in this that are delivering the impact at the community level day after day really are the publishers that are working within the communities, these entrepreneurial journalists who are risking a lot to do this work, you know, financially, professionally, and dealing with all sorts of online and other safety issues as well. I'd love if one of our awesome investors, while I'm speaking, could just share a few links to the publishers that inspire you, just so people could kind of check them out while I'm talking, because I don't feel like I have enough time to really celebrate them. So just really want to ground ourselves in their work as well. All right. So I'm Erin Miller. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Indiegraf. And Indiegraf is a platform that leverages data to accelerate the growth of independent community news outlets. So to get us started, I'll just tell you a little bit about my own story. I spent about a decade as an education reporter for national media, such as the Globe and Mail and Maclean's Magazine. And from that vantage point, I could see that a lot of the most valuable news in terms of content that could help people make change within their own communities. I was thinking about the education system, but this really applies in so many different issues. Really was at the local level, the information that people are getting done. But at the same time, the business model that was supporting that was failing. And so we weren't seeing beat reporters on education or environment at the local level. This was a big problem with the information ecosystem that I identified. So in 2014, I left the Globe and co-founded the Discourse with a group of other journalists because I really wanted to contribute to a new model that was focused on providing value to community members. And over the next 5 years, our team, led by a bunch of different folks, including Caitlin Havlack, who's my co-founder in Indiegraf, built the Discourse into a successful local news company. In the last couple of years, it's continued to grow under the leadership of Randy Shire, and it now serves 7 different communities in British Columbia, and is sister publications with Indigenews, the Wren in Kamloops, Sun Peaks Independent News in near Kamloops, the Discourse on the island, and there's plans for expansion. So that was really exciting to be part of that process for that 5-year period. In late 2019, when we had kind of cracked the nut on a business model that was working, Caitlin and I were starting to think about how can we expand our impact. The first community that the Discourse really worked in was on the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island. And with all due respect to the good people of Cowichan Valley, our vision for impact was much larger than that. We wanted to not only serve those folks, but we saw that there was thousands of new deserts across North America. And people who live in communities without access to reliable local news are less likely to vote, to volunteer, to trust their neighbors. They're more vulnerable to infectious disease. This is really a public health issue. It's a political disenfranchisement issue. And we saw a huge opportunity to make a large impact. Meantime, we kept hearing from other journalists who were wanting to start similar organizations and asking us advice. And so that's what inspired us to begin developing Indiegraf in late 2019. It's been really, really fun because we get to build a company that we really wish had existed and would have made it easier for us at Discourse. Yeah, and then the other piece I think is really important in terms of why we decided to take this scaling pathway to scale our impact rather than just continue to grow Discourse is that we didn't want to build another centrally owned media outlet. Like so many of the local news chains that we see here across Canada that provide this news, the incentives are just sort of strange, right? Like the local journalist have to report to an editor who reports to an executive who, in the case of Post Media, is reporting to a hedge fund that is based in New Jersey. So the community impact and the value is being provided locally, but the incentives are very distorted. So we really saw an exciting opportunity to rethink what a local news would look like if the incentives and the ownership and the accountability really stayed locally. And so that was our vision here. What happened next, of course, was the pandemic, and many dozens of community newspapers closed in a matter of weeks. This lit a fire under our butts, and we launched Indiegraf in May 2020 with 7 initial publishing partners. And since then, our tools have been used by more than 95 publishers to grow. Oops. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the conditions that that allow for systems change to happen in the space right now that we saw. So Indiegraf's fast growth is because we're seeing some of the trends of the creator economy coming to local news. There's sort of three main trends that make a huge opportunity for creators. First, traditional newspaper model is collapsing, and we're seeing the failure of the business model, but there's still a lot of revenue there. So there's a big market opportunity, $93 billion annually goes towards the local newspaper industry. Second, consumer behavior has changed, and we're seeing people going directly to producers of news rather than going through brands and doing that online instead of through broadcast or print. 19% people are now paying directly for that in the United States. This is growing in the United States and in Canada. And third, of course, cheap digital publishing tools have lowered the barrier to entry. So these three trends have created the conditions for the rise of the journalist entrepreneur, and is why we're seeing this growth happening. So right now, the number of small independent outlets across Canada and the US is growing by about 10% per year as folks continue to launch these small, scrappy news outlets. So in these conditions, we really see an enormous opportunity for impact. The hard. Local newspapers and layoffs, like, it's not good news. But we really see that the rise of these independent owners that are accountable to their communities and are better serving the information needs of more diverse communities really is a generational opportunity to transform local news for community benefit. We also, as we're seeing authoritarian governments rising in different parts of the world, we see distributed, decentralized chains of news as being much more robust in terms of standing up and to authoritarian governments as well. So just to share a little bit about our product, and then we'll get into the panel discussion as well. So a lot of journalists can launch a Substack or Ghost site. They can gain some organic traction, but the problem is that often what happens is that their growth really plateaus quickly, just because they don't have access to capital, the expertise, or the capacity and resources to realize their potential growth and revenue. So that's what Indiegraf is all about. It's a platform. We provide technology, tools. So that's a website. That's tools to monetize. We also provide expertise and capacity. So we have shared services across the whole network of publishers, where we're selling ads together, we're driving membership revenue together, et cetera. And then we are also providing some capital through the startup fund. We can actually give small amounts funding to invest in their own growth, which is really hard to access otherwise. I'm just going to skip over this next slide, just in the interest of time. But I do want to pause here on this ecosystem analysis or competitive analysis for one moment, because this is one of the places where I think you can design a business for impact, and one of the reasons that I think we've been successful in attracting impact investment. When we look at the competitive landscape, there are a lot of different vendors and different players that are in our space that are providing either the technology. Ghost or Newspack, which is a WordPress subsidiary, provides platforms for news outlets. Blue Lena, News Radio Hub have like consulting companies that help folks grow their audience. And there's, I mentioned a funder in here as well. But what we didn't see when we were looking at this, all of these things were sort of right sized for a larger, more established kind of outlet. And what Indiegraf is really, really obsessed with is serving startup and small players that probably wouldn't be able to launch at all otherwise. And we really think of ourselves as market builders. So creating a new category of small independent media by right sizing these kinds of resources for really, really small media, being obsessed with cost efficiency and these sorts of things, so that we can allow folks to enter the space who might not be able to otherwise. And that's also reflected through our pricing model. Just for context, the cheapest WordPress-based CMS on the market, content management system on the market, is $750 a month is the starting point, and we're really trying to optimize and keep that below. We've been able to do that by having a combination of a flat fee and a percentage. We've been testing this like what is the right mix between this over the last few months to try to really optimize it. But the idea is that as much funding as possible should be going to support the journalism. But also this allows people to enter, and as other publishers that we're supporting grow, they're actually able to support some of the publishers that are earlier in that process. So this model, this sort of pay-as-you-grow model, we call it, is designed to lower that barrier to entry and is very much part of our impact strategy. So just to end, I've got some other slides here I'm happy to pull up if questions arise that they're relevant to, but just to kind of end this presentation, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the type of investment that came in, and then this will introduce panelists today as well. So in order, we launched in early 2020, and we've now been around for it'll be 3 years pretty soon. We started very much by building a prototype in sort of late 2019, 2020. We didn't want to, invest in Indiegraf unless the concept and the hypothesis that we had would work. We designed a way to test that program. The Indie News Challenge was incubated within Discourse Media before we spun out a new company to deliver this into Indiegraf. That was supported with foundation funding from InSpirit Foundation, and Sadia is on the call and can speak a little bit to why they do that and how that strategy really helps kind of de-risk for other investors to come on later. Based on those results, we were able to talk to some of our other partners that we had relationships with for a long time. Google News Initiative, the Meta Journalism Project as well, was part of that initial sponsorship, non-dilutive funding through a services agreement that gave us the initial cash that we needed to get launched to support our first publishers. And we have a representative of Google News Initiative here today to talk about that. Later in 2020, once we sort of had something that was working, this is the seed stage, we're still like figuring out what can make this replicable. We were able to secure our first seed round of funding for angel investors and impact funds. So this was the first investment in the sense that these were convertible notes. Equity investment. So that was the sort of first pure investment that wasn't non-dilutive support in some way. And we've got Jessica from New Ventures to speak about that, and Graham from Spring to talk about why those two organizations supported us. Since then, we've been working with our existing cap table and existing partners to continue to grow this and build this. And in late 2022, we secured an investment from Mucker Labs, which is a venture capital accelerator based in LA, where we're working on with them over the next year to really see, is venture funding something that can work to maximize our impact? So that'll be a really interesting experiment that I'd love to reflect back on in the future. So I will just leave it there so we can move into questions. Yeah, and I would just encourage anyone who would like to connect to either follow our journey or just to ask any questions. There's my contact information there. And I hope that we can have a great conversation with this awesome panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Before we end, can you just go to the impact slide that you have on that deck? I had the benefit of being able to see this deck before the event here, and I just want to share it with everyone, just to have people. I don't know if we can still pull it up. Is it up?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm going to pull it up in 1 second here.
So in a moment. There we go.
Yeah.
Well, so that's. No, I'll let you sort of play with that for a second. We will have some time for questions. Please put your questions in the chat, and we're capturing all of those. We're going to do the panel with our panelists now, and I have some questions for them. And then as we go, just add your questions in. And then as Muska mentioned, we'll have some breakout rooms at the end. So here's the impact thesis. What about the actual impact slide where you actually share the impact that you've had? So
Yeah,
this is
so
the goal. So
this
speak
was
to
the
that.
goal
Yeah.
that we laid out, and the highlighted pieces there. We sort of broke down into these main pillars: strong local media. How are we going to measure that? Underrepresented communities. How are we going to measure that? Public benefit for all. Then we laid out these. And then we laid out. This is actually a slide from back in 2020. I was very relieved to see that we have done what we said we were going to do. But this is basically how we got to from an impact thesis in narrative to a framework for measuring this over time. And this is what we measure to show our impact.
Thank you. And just read out that thesis for us if you can, because I think this is really important for social entrepreneurs. You need to not just prove that you're going to be able to keep the lights on, but actually create impact. And so a strong local news media serve underrepresented communities, civic participation increases, polarization decreases, contributing to more equitable and efficient governments, public institution, and policies that create public benefit for all.
Yeah,
so that's
very
amazing.
wordy, but I'll also add that in this presentation, where this slide came from, like each of these sections also has a research basis behind it. So in our due diligence room, like in our data room that we can share with investors as they're doing due diligence on us, they can actually poke holes in our impact thesis by going to that research and seeing, well, why do you believe that polarization decreases? Let's look at that and let's consider that critically. So yeah, that was our approach.
Thank you. So I think that this sort of integrated approach of impact and financial sustainability was quite crucial to our panelists today in varying degrees. And I'm so pleased to introduce, I'm just going to run through, do a brief introduction of each of them, and then we'll move through some questions. So starting with Sadia Zaman. Sadia, do you want to just give a little wave? Thanks, Sadia. Sadia brings a wealth of media arts and nonprofit experience. And to her role as the CEO of the Inspirit Foundation. And she has a senior level role at the Ontario Museum, the Royal Ontario Museum. So she's held a number of senior roles. So I'm stumbling over my words today. At the Royal Ontario Museum, CBC, Women in Film and Television. She began her career as a journalist, creating hundreds of hours of original, crucially acclaimed content for Vision TV, CBC, and TVO. And she's won dozens of awards for journalism and has been honored many times for her leadership. And so welcome, Sadia. We also have Andrew Wicken here. He's the head of news partnerships at Google Canada. He's a seasoned digital media executive and strategist with experience in strategy, digital marketing, programmatic media, operations, and management. And Andrew got involved with Indiegraf in the form of corporate sponsorship. We have Graham Day. Graham, you want to give us a little wave there? Chief Investment Officer at Spring Activator. Graham has extensive experience working with social enterprises, both as an investor and as an executive. He currently runs company acceleration and investor education programs at Spring. Indiegraf participated in one of those programs where a $100,000 investment was made from a cohort of 20 individual impact investors. And then last but not least, Jessica Salinas is the Chief Investment Officer at New Media Ventures. Hi, Jessica. Jessica is responsible for the cultivation of early stage deal flow and portfolio management, building mission-driven partnerships and leading the growth and direction of the investment team. Jessica represents a second, more traditional impact investor who has also just completed a full equity and anti-racism review of their process. So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm going to start with Sadia, and I'm going to start with you because I know that Inspirit was an early supporter of Erin and her work, and the work of Discourse and Indiegraf. And I want to know, as a foundation, a philanthropic foundation, how's this work tied to your mission? And did you face any barriers as a philanthropic organization working with a social purpose organization?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And one I think that the Canadian foundation sector struggles with more than the American foundation sector. I actually think foundations in the US are way ahead of us on this. In this case, I actually knew about discourse before I started at InSpirit, which is Andrea's old haunt, and had been kind of following the discourse story before I even arrived at InSpirit. One of the things, because of my background in journalism and in media, it is not enough to not know this sector well. And what I mean essentially is Erin knows the sector. She understands the value of the civic function that journalism plays in a democratic society. And there's also editorial considerations. And this is where I think a lot of our kind of misunderstanding within the philanthropic sector here happens around journalism. A lot of folks see it as communications, which it's not. Journalism is its own function. It's a civic function. It's about health of democracies, and it's completely tied to our mission in the sense that we're really interested in creating alternate ecosystems. As someone who's worked in legacy media, that space is not going to change for a very long time. And not discounting the work that's being done in that space, but we need to try and find other ways to actually make sure that more voices are in editorial leadership positions. And this is a huge part of the equity question. And I felt very much that Erin understood that in her gut right from the beginning in terms of who gets to shape the story, actually gets to shape policy, gets to shape public opinion about communities, gets to shape how we incarcerate people, who we incarcerate. So the ripple effects are significant in terms of the framing around journalism and the editorial leadership in a lot of publications. This is a possibility for equitable framing, for equitable leadership in the most significant positions, which are the positions that hold power. And so I'm really interested in the power piece of this, and not so much interested in the internship programs and the million other things we've tried forever. This is, we have to have folks who have the power to make change. So that was another part of the mission that really resonated for us. I think the third really important kind of consideration for Canadian foundations, and where there's a lot of skittishness, is that in this case, we have something that eventually morphed into Indiegraf that became a for-profit activity. And I think as foundations in Canada, we're very nervous about anything that is for profit. And I think the Americans have actually figured this out, like in terms of the walls, the editorial walls, and the influence and all of those pieces. Whereas here, we're at the very beginning of this journey, and we're often first in, we're often de-risking. And so the de-risking question was also a really big one for us. And I think because we had the collective expertise in-house, we also had expertise in Erin. And so we were able to jump in.
Thank you. And Erin, how important was philanthropic support to the success of Indiegraf?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and just say that InSpirit in particular is really important. And Sadia said, they're often first in. And what was really valuable from our perspective as innovators, both at Discourse and at Indiegraf, and is that like there was the flexibility to take some chances and allow us to actually have quite a lot of flexibility to make mistakes and take twists and turns. And we've had a transparent and supportive and two-way, I would hope, relationship with Sadia and her team and InSpirit for a long time. So that we're learning from them and we can talk to them about our challenges, and they've created that safe environment for us to do that. Like, it's never felt like some of the power dynamic that can be in that funding conversation has really not been there. They're really intentional about breaking that down. So that was really key, to take some chances on us early so that we could do that first project, for example, and start to generate some results and test our hypotheses that then we could bring to other funders to support.
Thanks. And Sadia, I mean, in terms of granting to this, is that what was it that allowed you to have that flexibility? Was it because it was a grant rather than an investment? And how did how did you navigate all of that? Were there barriers you faced in that?
Yeah, well, Erin had to work through a trustee, right, a charitable trustee,
Right.
and that allowed us to grant, and so that was our way in. So it wasn't difficult, it wasn't complicated.
Right. Thank you. Andrew, I want to ask you, this is, I just sort of say, I think that Erin alluded to it earlier, and I've sort of mentioned that, the success of this has really been an integrated capital approach. It's been sort of granting and different levels of investment, and that's been quite key in terms of creating the flexibility. For Andrew, you actually came in for corporate sponsorship, which is interesting. And I'm wondering, what boxes did Indiegraf tick for Google's corporate sponsorship?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's probably something I should have flagged earlier. When I think about how Google and the Google News Initiative got involved with Erin and Indiegraf, I really do like to think of it as partnership more than sponsorship. And what I mean by that is I think, for a lot of organizations, sponsorship is sort of like it's the easiest thing to do to sort of get yourself behind an organization. But I think for us, we look over the longer run, and we actually want to learn along with the folks that we're investing and supporting. So I guess the first point I'd make is I do think partnerships is really what our focus is more than sponsorships. But in saying that, I think your question was around checkboxes. And I have some thoughts. I don't actually have a list of checkboxes that I go through when we meet with folks like Erin and Indiegraf, but the very first thing that comes to mind, I don't know who said it, I probably should, but somebody said that relationships move at the speed of trust. And the point here is that I and others throughout the Google News Initiative got to know Erin really early on and over a period of time. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that yes, there's a business case and a pitch, but at the end of the day, you're talking about people. And the fact that I knew Erin so well and what she was about and her organization's mission and values, that's really, to me, like the number one checkbox and foundation you have to build on. The second thing I would say is there's just a lot of alignment, frankly, in terms of the goals of Indiegraf and that of the Google News Initiative. Broadly speaking, the Google News Initiative, which I focus on here in Canada, it's really about moving the news ecosystem into the digital age. And it's just plainly obvious, I think, really early in our dealings with Erin and Indiegraf that there was just a ton of alignment there. So that's important. I don't know that she's used it today, but Erin often talks about systems change, which is a phrase I really latched onto early on in our relationship. And I think her focus on impact and scale of impact is very much kind of on my list, if you will, of things that I think about. Sometimes we talk about wanting to work with multipliers. I would call Erin and Indiegraf one of the best multipliers I've ever worked with. And what I mean by that is we know that the work we do with Erin and Indiegraf cascades through the ecosystem, and therefore the impact of our investment goes far beyond that initial step. And then there were two other things that I thought I would know. One is, you mentioned it, a lot of them are here, but Erin, I think, has done a really great job building a community of funders, which I think is huge. A lot of diverse perspectives. I think there's validation that can come with knowing that others are also involved. So I think that's key. And then the last one I would say, you heard it, but I think Erin and Indiegraf have always had a really clear narrative and goals. What you haven't seen today that I've seen, and I think the other supporters here would say they've seen, is they've also got a plan to get there. And so I think you kind of need to have both. And that was, for me, always pretty evident with Erin, very, very clear every time, we met kind of what the goal was, but also being able to back that up with a clear plan. I mean, that to me is, it's kind of the first couple of things I think about in reflecting back on how we got involved.
Can I just respond to that a little for one quick sec, Andrea? Yeah, on the plan, and one of the reasons that in the slides that I shared, I focus a lot on our business and like our product and our business model and our revenue model and our pricing model and how we've considered all those different things, is because I really think those are like key design pieces that are related to the impact. And you know, we're super grateful for the support of Google. We also don't want to rely on the support of Google because that's not going to be our long-term sustainable approach to being able to deliver this impact over time. So we do really consider that partnership or corporate partnership, corporate sponsorship revenue as seed funding to allow us to get to the next place. And having built in a revenue and a business model from day one that we've been like tracking and reporting on is part of that. One of the participants asked why we chose for-profit over nonprofit, and you know, I mean, nonprofits can also have earned revenue and business models. Like, so I'm not suggesting that, but we really wanted to see a high scale impact here, and so we felt if we could crack that on a business model that could really work, then that would allow us in a for-profit model, and that would allow us to tap into the kinds of capital to really scale this much beyond what we could have done as a nonprofit within one country. So just a couple of thoughts on that.
That's great, thank you. And Erin, did you approach other corporations? And did you have any reservations around working with Google?
No, I didn't have any reservations about working with Google. The only other corporation that we've worked with is Facebook, Meta, whatever you want to call them, which we're no longer partnered with. They have pulled back from their support in the journalism space. And you know, I have all sorts of criticisms for Meta, of course. We can have a whole other webinar on that. But what my experience has been working with both of our corporate partners who are totally different and doing it for different reasons is really about the relationships with the people. The Google News Initiative has been committed to supporting the future of the news industry for a long time, and they're going to continue doing that. I'm confident of that based on our conversations, even as they're under quite a lot of pressure with their own the market is very challenging right now. Yes, so I haven't had any specific problems with that so far.
Thank you. Graham, I'm going to move to you as the an experienced investor who's run both social enterprises and worked with many entrepreneurs. What stood out to you about Indiegraf? What potential did you see in them? What did you see in the idea? What did you see in the team? What areas did they need support to reach this potential that you could sort of imagine?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. Maybe I'll just first kind of put a bit of context into how this investment came about. It was in a program that we call the Impact Investor Challenge, where we recruit and have about 20 investors or so put in their personal capital into a pool of funds. And those investors work with 5 finalist companies that have been sort of down selected from a larger pool and study those 5 companies and ultimately make a decision to invest into one. And so it's an interesting format in that Erin and Indiegraf were amongst this very fascinating but eclectic group of companies. There was a health app company, there was an agriculture company, a chocolate company, I think, and others. And so the investors were looking at having to identify the investment in and of itself, and standing on its own merits of the opportunity, of the risks that they perceived, the expertise of the founder, but they were also looking at it relatively against what else was on the table for impact. And so obviously we know Indiegraf was ultimately successful in that. I was part of that program as an investor, and so we saw Erin's ability to present the opportunity as one that was, despite being early stage, had elements of being de-risked. Her expertise, obviously, and coming from the discourse, the market that was there. But I think what I most remember about this was her ability to explain to a group of investors who are not specialized in the media space at all, or in the news space, about what this impact, why this needed to happen. And so it kind of showing what she just showed on that slide, the numbers, what she was going to track, what she was going to measure over time, crystallized this sort of problem solution match in the eyes of the investors, which ended up really being successful. It helped, of course, to have names like Google behind it, and Spirit Foundation. So there was this credibility that came with the deal as well. So it was quite an amazing package of that credibility, Erin's expertise, the kind of preciseness in her plan that Andrew was speaking to, and then the credibility of the partners that were coming on board. So it all came together in an investment. And the final thing I think I would say is that investors look for this fit with their own personal thesis, and it's about risk, it's about market, it's about sector, but it's also about how they want to interact with the founder. And so Erin was really open from the beginning, and she still is in her investor mailings, asking for support and making this a really transparent relationship. And the investors in our group, and I know others, love that as being a sort of a dynamic relationship. It's really great.
Thank you, Graham. And Erin, you speak in your case study about how discouraging the pitching cycle can be. What has been the most difficult part of this process? And so how is the Spring Activator different and possibly a turning point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a long hustle to raise capital in any environment. And yeah, I wanna flag, like, I had a long relationship speaking, to InSpirit and Sadia, and and Andrew mentioned this, that like our relationship grew at the speed of trust. I talked to Google probably for 12 to 18 months before, something like that. New Media Ventures, who I hope we'll hear from Jessica next, we pitched 2 different times, and didn't get selected the first time, got to the interview stage the second year. So like that was a 3-year commitment, and took in the feedback and tried to use that to improve what we were doing and learn from it. Spring as well, like we were part of the first cohort and we were not successful in there, and then we listened to the feedback. So I guess the hardest part for me, well, 2 pieces, and I speak about this in the case study itself. One of them is to find your people. It is really discouraging to be pitching in environments where there's no way that you're going to succeed in that environment. So I remember one pitch event in particular, and you just have to go to all the events and get out there and network, and it can be kind of painful. But I remember one in particular, and I'm glad that I don't actually remember the specifics of who led it or anything, so I don't have to name any names. But I got up and I did my thing, and it was in front of a whole group of people. It felt like a bit like a lion's den sort of approach. And then this guy got up there who was pitching a basically like an electric cigarette that was with caffeine, that was like, and he was talking about their market traction in China and how big the addressable market was. And he won, and I was like, oh, I'm screwed. This is not my people. This is not my environment. We're not going to win here, right? But that can be so discouraging. And that brings me to the second piece of what is hardest is it's just the like emotional, like managing my own psychology as the person who is raising capital for this organization. And it can be pretty lonely. I talk to my colleagues a lot, but it is my job and it's on my shoulders. And I've gotten better at that over the years, and just like understanding it's a process. You have to get, 9 no's before you're going to get a yes, and just running a funnel and having some discipline and having a plan for my fundraising ahead of time so that I can manage my own ups and downs, because it does feel like a bit of a roller coaster. And there's nothing that kills a deal like feeling desperate or anything like that. That confidence is really key. So managing my own feelings about it is really important.
I think, Erin, you said something really crucial, and that is the ability to actually hear feedback. I think people underestimate this as a serious skill. Not that you necessarily have to take everything that everybody says, but you have the humility sometimes to know that there are actually people in spaces that may be able to add more context to what you're doing. And I think often what happens is that I think everybody sees folks who are so black and white about their vision and how to get there. And the feedback loop is completely closed. And there's nothing you can say. There's no context that will be heard. There is no kind of willingness to kind of extend the grace in both directions. And I think that when you talk about the speed of trust, Andrew, like that's a huge part of the trust building, is holding firm to your vision, but at the same time, so it's an and, recognizing that other people bring a different perspective. And with all of the different perspectives, you're going to get to some place that feels like a bit of a hole.
Yeah. Thank you, Sally, for bringing that up. And as someone who's pitched before, I know that the key to that is managing your own emotions. And so thank you for being so honest about that, right? Like being able to not feel discouraged, but just be open. And as you say, Sadia, learn from what's being offered, whatever it is that's being offered, whether it's good or bad. Yeah, thank you. Jessica, I was just going to go to,
Oh, Andrew, go for it.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add, Erin, you mentioned something around picking your people. And I know someone had brought up, why a for-profit. And we give grants to nonprofits, and we also make for-profit investments. And I'll say that the stakes are different for for-profit investments when it comes to like picking your people, right? These are people that will, for a foreseeable future, have equity in your company. And therefore picking your investors and picking those people that are allowed to have that equity is a two-way street, right? And so, Erin, I love that example that you gave. You were at this, pitch competition, and you're like, these are not my people. They're not values aligned. And even if they would have given you money or offered you money, maybe it wasn't the right move to accept it for the long term. And so these are different considerations, I think, when you're thinking of investment, and specifically like impact investment. So just wanted to point that out, that really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. Erin, do you want to respond to that? And Jessica, I have some other questions around. Yeah, but first, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I would say that the feedback loop is actually a really good way to qualify who your people are. And I agree with what Sadia said, that like being able to take feedback and accept feedback is a practice, and it's not one that I'm super natural at, to be completely honest. I'm a bad student. There's a reason I never went and got a master's, because like I remember being in grade 1 and thinking I would teach this lesson differently. Like I have all sorts of ego that I have to deal with all the time. And being the founder of a startup is sort of like professionally accepting advice. Like that's actually a lot of what you do, and having to like parse it, because a lot of the time it conflicts too. So I've had to work a lot on part of that role of managing my own like psychology is like I've had to work a lot on humility, right? And like going into things from an abundance mindset and accepting feedback and really thinking about it, even if I'm not quite ready to accept it, because sometimes the timing is wrong and it's painful to hear it. So that's been something that I've had to actively work on, and have sought mentorship to support that and everything, because it doesn't come naturally to me. So yeah.
Yeah.
And just to say to Jessica, like New Media Ventures provided some feedback that, we were like, oh God damn it, they're wrong. And then we were like, well, actually, they're kind of right. And then, so that actually informed the next step, right? But sometimes it takes some time to process that. And it's much easier just to reject it, right? Rather than to really listen to it. So that told us that these were were our people. Like, they're thinking seriously about how do you scale solutions to democracy problems. I want to learn from that process, even if I can't yet be part of their club. So stuck with it.
Graham, I hear you jumping in here.
Oh, just wanted to, build on this discussion, because I think
Okay.
it's easy to say that, as founders, you should, take feedback, but it's not just taking feedback. It's like you said, Erin, it's parsing it, it's dealing with the conflicting comments. And I'm in investor rooms all the time, and I have to bite my lip because I see these poor founders trying to like be gracious with solicited and unsolicited feedback coming into their models. And sort of knowing what's appropriate on many investor checklists, at least at the angel level, there's this like checkbox for like, is the founder coachable? And it sounds kind of, I don't know, kind of weird the way that comes across, but I think what it really means is like, is the founder not overly defensive? Are they open to a discussion? It doesn't mean they're taking your advice and like, thanking you for it. It's like creating that space for a discussion and not putting up too many barriers around willing to kind of move or explore. So it's
and
cool.
that's actually really important with impact too, right? Because there are some things that like I'm going to reject that. As I mentioned at the end of my presentation, we're currently going through this process of trying to see if venture funding is going to work for us. And my co-founder and I, we have like a set of 5 like rules. These are those core values that we're like, we aren't going to compromise on those. So to find that balance, I think, in an impact company, when you're trying to figure out how to bake that into the DNA is also critical. Sometimes you do have to listen to your gut. But yeah, finding that balance, I think, is what has been the learning for me.
So sometimes they don't get it. Sometimes they're wrong. And sometimes you need to listen and learn, but you always have to listen, because the other thing about running a startup is you have to be constantly learning, right? Like, you're going to get things wrong and iterate and change, and it's not baked yet. And so I think maybe that coachable piece is actually it may be more about the actual process of starting something new that other people haven't done before. Jessica, to this, this is a great time. I was going to ask you, you're sort of the most recent investor into Indiegraf, and I mean, it sort of goes to what was on your due diligence list, and how is it the same and different from traditional investors, and what were you expecting from Indiegraf in terms of performance?
Yeah, I think you'll hear a lot of similar things that everybody else has talked about. And I think the best way to answer the question is by talking a little bit more about that journey Erin was talking about with New Media Ventures. And also for context, I came in at the very end of the Indiegraf investment, but I learned a lot from the NMV team that was here in place, and also Erin about the journey that had taken place. And so Erin actually had been in the NMV sphere for 2+ years, right, before we actually invested. And she had initially approached NMV with the discourse, which you heard a little bit more about. And we had actually passed on investing those 2 prior years. But it was through those conversations that we developed a relationship with Erin. And I think in turn, it sounds like Erin received helpful feedback and also a strong understanding of our thesis, which Graham, you talked about, right? Every investor has its own thesis. And so that was really important, I think, during those years that we were developing that relationship. So when Erin approached NMV with Indiegraf, it had actually been a while since NMV had made a local news play. And not because we weren't being approached by those types of founders or those types of ideas, but rather because we hadn't yet found a company that really aligned with what we were looking for at those early stages, particularly when we're looking at media investments. And so I'm going to kind of refine them down to 4, and that's the team, scalability, sustainability, and then a clear political progressive power building angle, which is NMV's thesis. So we knew Erin was a strong founder, and you heard that over and over from everyone that's speaking, right? She had this background in the news space and the media space. She had that expertise, but it went beyond that. So for us, and again, this is going to be a little bit similar to what Graham, you were just saying, when we're investing in early stage companies, that means statistically that what the company is and looks like at the time we invest in will look drastically different in 3 to 5 years. So the founders' qualities for us are equally, if not more, important at this stage. And so we believed Erin had those characteristics. She was resilient, she knew how to pivot, and she took feedback well, but stood strong where she needed to. And we had seen that ourselves firsthand over the course of those years, by the way she had handled the no's, by the way she had managed like and implemented prior feedback. So for us, like that team angle was there. When it came to sustainability and scalability, Indiegraf's backend tech platform was the first venture in this space that we felt was actually scalable. And so I think what exemplifies that is we usually invest in US companies, and Indiegraf is Canada center based, right? And so for us, we truly believed that Indiegraf could scale beyond Canada into other countries. And when we looked at the numbers, we believed the economics, they were plausible as she scaled out. And so that was a big plus for us. But ultimately, what set Indiegraf apart for us was that clear linkage. And you saw the very pretty like slide that she created, that clear linkage between what she was building and the impact it could have, specifically when it came to political power building. So she came ready. She like had clearly delineated how Indiegraf was tied to civic participation and polarization. She was committed to centering populations that had been overlooked and that we deeply cared about here in the United States, so Black, Latino, Indigenous. And she had shown that through her strategy and her model. So she was starting in news deserts, right? Her model allowed for local news publishers to keep ownership, and ownership in these communities is so, so important. We saw that in her customer pipeline. And so for us, it wasn't just an afterthought, it was clearly embedded in every aspect of what she was building, in the strategy and the pricing, et cetera. And so for us, that was like the clear dedication as an entrepreneur to building out that impact through her model. And so, I guess to summarize, it doesn't really differ that much from your traditional investor when we're looking as an impact investor. Like we're still looking at economics, the potential for scale and growth. We're still doing customer calls, looking at the budget and the financials, et cetera. I think where we differ is that in addition, so it's more, right? In addition, we're also looking at the potential for impact. And we gauge that by Indiegraf's theory of change, who Indiegraf was entering as a customer, what geographic areas she was starting in, et cetera. And the last part of your question, Andrea, is expectations. So I think when we're talking about expectations, or I think what I like to call it is our hopes. Our hope is that Indiegraf scales, and not just to the end of a great return on investment for us, but also a return for an impact. And in this case, I think a return on the impact on the way we consume media via trusted, diverse messengers.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I think I'm hearing a lot of thematic similarities from different perspectives, right? So there's, in terms of a social enterprise, that the mission is, you can't really argue with the need for the organization to create mission, and you need someone that actually really fully gets that. And Sadia, you suggest, and really understood this at every level, not just writing an article, but the systems, taking a systems lens at what she was working on. And for you as a foundation creating impact, that was key. And that exploration and how to do that was something that you could support. And then we're hearing that the team, the learnability and adaptability to move through, we've all seen that how Indiegraf has already transitioned from sort of an idea to how many publishers, 87, 92 publishers in the last 2 to 3 years is amazing, right? And so that adaptability, which, Erin, I'm just so grateful for you being honest that it's not easy to hear all the time, right? Like that sort of constant having to go. And the thing that I take from that is, really the importance of having your list and moving through it, right? And sometimes leaving your work at the door, but going back to the list and not having to do it step by step, but having a plan.
And I can also add, Andrea, that one of the things that is really helpful is that when we understand that if you're building alternate ecosystems, you are inherently working in systems change. And so that understanding of systems change was very, very consistent from the first time actually that I met Erin. But the other piece of it is too, because we are so concerned about shifting narrative power, that's our tagline, is to shift the narrative, who holds the power to create the narrative and how do we make those shifts? And our real deep concern for communities that are underrepresented. But what we're often seeing is a lot of pitches from incredible people doing incredible work within communities. But what's often missing is actually at the end of the day, it's a business. Right? So the editorial passion piece is central, but so are all the other skills, because it is a vicious environment. And especially in Canada, the funding sources are very, very limited. And so to have the combination of both, to know that essentially you're running a business from a place of passion and commitment to a greater civic good.
Yeah, and that's social entrepreneurship. I mean, thank you. I think that's thank you, Sadia. We have time for a few questions from our audience here. I have one question that I'll kick it off with to all of the panelists, which is, what's next in your imagination for Indiegraf in the next 5 years? Like, what is your vision for the growth of Indiegraf? And, Sadia, if I'll start with you, and that's sort of like, what do you believe what do you hope that shift will look like, and how Indiegraf will impact it?
This is a really, really tough question, because we try actually very much not to impose our vision on, and this is part of the trust building, to say that this is what we'd like to see. What I tend to say is, this is our mission. And I think I just articulated our vision, so I don't want to take up any more time around that. But really, it's up to Erin, right? Does our vision mesh with hers? And if it doesn't, she shouldn't change her vision. She has a very strong vision. So I won't say much more. And other people should have a chance to speak.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists? Yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing, I don't think it's selfish, but as we say, selfishly, I'd like to see is I'd like to see Erin continue to inspire others to take on these types of causes. I wish there were 10 folks like Erin, who I could characterize as such incredible multipliers. I haven't yet found 10, but I will take any meeting with anybody that tells me I'm missing an obvious one. But I do think, Erin's work, I think, hopefully inspires others to take on this challenge as well, because I don't think, she can't do it alone. And we need more than just Indiegraf. We need, more publishers, but also more organizations supporting publishers sort of in this area. And then the second thing I would volunteer, this idea of 10x thinking, right? Like if Erin succeeds, over a period here and can demonstrate that this works and the impact is there, what I get excited about is like what the next chapter looks like. And, if you can prove this case out that this investment really does drive impact, and you need time to see that play out, I get really excited about what, the scale of the investments and the impact can be, over that kind of, like, as you say, 3 to 5 year time frame. That's what gets me excited, especially in Canada. Sadie made some comments around some of the distinctions between the US and the Canadian market. I see that in spades all the time. And so, my hope is that we can catch up quick. And I think, Indiegraf and people like Aaron are a big part of getting there.
Thank you, Andrew. And Aaron, I see your hand.
Yeah.
You mentioned a moment when you wanted to do something and you looked around and there was a whole bunch of other folks doing it as well.
That's what I was going to say. I'm feeling, I'm totally honored by everything you all are saying. I'm feeling slightly uncomfortable too, because it's definitely not all me. This is not my vision. This is, I am the one who's privileged to be able to be the person whose job it is to talk to external folks. This is my team. At not just a few of the folks on my team. We've got a team of 24 that are working on this now, and we're working with a network of we've worked with more than 85 publishers, and they're the ones on the ground doing the work. So I guess what I would say in response to your question, Andrea, about what is our vision for the future, my personal journey over the last few years from Discourse, where I was the editor-in-chief who ultimately made the decisions at the end of the day about which stories got told, or I got to tell them myself, to recognizing that if we're actually going to have a more equitable ecosystem, we need to shift from being the gatekeepers to empowering others, has all been about that journey of trying to use the limited power that I have, or the limited power that anyone has, to try to empower others to do the work. And so I see my job as the CEO of a startup as, threefold. One, helping articulate a vision, but it's a collaborative process that needs to constantly be responding to listening to advisors, to investors, to our different stakeholders, to our publishers, but articulating that vision, then making sure we have enough money in the bank to deliver on it, and making sure we have the right people with us. That's it. That's the end of my job. But I just happen to be the person who's has the privilege of representing that whole community of folks that are behind Indiegraf in events like this.
Thank you, Aaron. Well said. Well said. We have one question from the audience that talks about the number one criteria for many of you was the relationship and the trust for the investor. And the question is, this is a classic case of sort of network effects. And, there's a sort of a possible loop of people who know each other, trust each other, and invest in each other. And if you're a newcomer, it can feel very difficult to break in because no one knows you or trusts you. And how does your team, in terms of investors and from the system, what are your thoughts on this in terms of how to break this cycle?
I can speak about this because NMVU went through a process of analyzing and auditing our processes and systems in place for how we invested. And what we found is that we were operating in the same way as your typical VC, and that we were depending a lot on our network and therefore investing in the same type of people over and over again. And so we changed the way that we invest to the point where now we don't take warm intros. And everyone has to go through the same process, and we don't give weight to whether you were referred to by someone in our network, and therefore we are going in completely with new eyes, open eyes on every single submission and idea and company that we're seeing. We're also internally distributed power with our team. Therefore, I don't see ideas until they've made it to later, and two other people on our team are the ones that are looking and screening and checking out ideas, and therefore, even if I know a founder, it doesn't have any weight on their opinion, on their expertise, etc. And so it's a continuous process, but it does take a lot of intentionality and a lot of effort and a lot of willingness, I think, to really look internally at all of our processes to understand how are we're talking about systems change, right? How are we perpetuating those same systems effects that have negatively impacted people, that come from my background, that are first generation Latinas immigrants, right? So there are a few ways we're doing that. I'm
Yeah.
happy to talk to someone about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know, are you documenting and sharing that? Are you writing about it at all as an organization? I think it would be interesting for investors in Canada to be able to sort of learn from that experience, because it is, you know, having worked to demonstrate equity in an organization, it's more work. It's crucial, and it's crucial for impact, and it does take, it's not straightforward.
It's not. We actually did a year after my time here and doing a lot of discovery with the entrepreneurs that had either gone through a process or that we had invested in or that we hadn't invested in, and learning a lot of hard things about how we had harmed certain communities. We wrote an apology, revamped our systems, and did put out a letter on how we were planning on essentially taking accountability and implementing those changes. And this year we're doing a follow-up on that, which I'm happy to distribute to whoever would find it helpful.
I think that would be wonderful. I hope you'll share it, because it's an important thing to talk about. Graham.
Well, yeah, what an amazing self-reflection process, Jessica. That's so open and transparent. I was going to say, I mean, in our world, we're trying to embark on our own systems change in early stage impact investing and angel investing. I think the funds, as Jessica's talking about, the institutional funders doing it is a crucial way to sort of lead and guide and make the system more equitable. But at the angel level, like investors that are going to be putting in the $20,000-$30,000 in checks at the beginning before funds will look at you as founders, I mean, that's highly skewed to older white men, frankly, and it continues to be that way. We're trying to, through these programs that we're running, change that. About 40% of our investors are women, about the same amount BIPOC, and you can see that the winners of the programs, we've done this 9 times now, 7 are women, founders or co-founders, and 4 are BIPOC. And so you can sort of see it playing out live, that the more diversity we have in the investor room, the more, I think, diversity we're seeing in the winners and going to typically underrepresented communities. So we're trying to push that. That's an experiment that's living out in front of our eyes. We started doing this about once a year. We're doing now 6 or 7 of these programs per year. So happy to share more in the chat. But our small contribution, I hope, to making the early stage angel invest and impact environment a little more fair.
Thank you, Graham. I think that this is something I've heard in a number of places, that the investors, the lack of representation in the investors is a huge barrier to the diversity of the investees. And I think it's, you know, Sadi, you've got your hand up.
And
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that, Andrea. One of the things we know, we don't have to figure this out. There's already enough organizations have done the work on this, endless reports, Foundation for Black Communities, and I'm speaking here particularly around philanthropy. Foundation for Black Communities, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, like we're heavily involved in both, have done due diligence up and down the yin yang. Like, you know, we don't need any more information in terms of knowing what the impacts of resources and the lack of resources is on communities. And we know where the bottlenecks are. We absolutely know where the bottlenecks are. And I think for us, it's, you know, for us, like we're also having a lot of behind the door conversations with impact investors and insisting when, you know, people approach us that we actually see a list of their board. We want to see who's on the board. We want to see who's in leadership. And that can be a tough process. But we have a little bit of power as a foundation, and this is a lot of the stuff that happens behind the scenes, and we all have a responsibility to do something with whatever power we have, and often it's a question that's not even come up, or they're stunned. So out of all the sectors I've ever had kind of, you know, some access to, I would say that world is probably the most, is very far behind in terms of the conversations that people are having on the ground in communities, and where money is flowing and where it's not flowing. Resources are everything. And so, you know, what is our responsibility to make sure that the resources flow?
Yeah, yeah. I know that I've had a lot of tense conversations around things like that. I am just conscious we have structured this so that we have some breakout rooms. I haven't reached all of the questions, but folks do have the opportunity to speak to our panelists in a more intimate setting. Muska, can I hand it over to you? First, thank you, everyone, and then I'll hand it over to Muska. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea, and also to all our panelists for a very insightful and informative discussion, and for sharing such a powerful investment readiness journey, Erin, with us today.